It's time to build Starkiller's lightsaber. For this project, I'm going to be installing the SK Rogue Apprentice V3 from Corbanth. As for the parts I'm going to be using, let's start with the NeoPixel connector holder I made, along with the NeoPixel connector itself. Then I have some options for real quartz crystals. Next, here are the activation and auxiliary buttons, the NeoPixel accent light I'm going to be using for the crystal, and the resistor that goes with it. And then here's the soundboard I'm going to be using. It's a Crystal Focus 10. And then we have the battery contacts, Bluetooth module, and OLED display. For sound, this thing will use a 28mm bass speaker. Lastly, this will all go inside of the chassis I designed for it, and here are some extra parts that came with the hilt itself. And I forgot to mention this, but we're using an 18650 lithium-ion battery. But now that I have all the parts, and I have the chassis designed, printed, and ready to go, it's time to get to work. Let's begin by taking everything apart. I think that'll be the easiest way to go about this. Whoops. Geez, this thing has too many small parts. Now I guess I'll remove the control box. Now it looks like I have to remove these 6 screws, and then the bunny ears, before we're finally able to take this entire shroud off. Now it looks like I'm able to remove these brass-colored crystal chamber pieces. This is what's going to hold the crystal for the crystal chamber. And it looks like this will be the NeoPixel holder. Now we just unscrew the grip. Okay, that was a lot of work, but we're now fully prepared to start installing the electronics. Let's take a look at this control box and figure out how we can set up the buttons. So I'm going to be using these tactile switches that are pretty tall, that way it can poke through the control box and we can press it easier. Now the tricky thing about this is going to be the underside of the buttons. I have to come up with a way to hold them in place so that when I press the buttons they don't fall all the way through. And just in case, I'm also going to be chopping off the extra legs so that they don't touch the metal of the control box. And now that that's done, I'm going to be pre-soldering the remaining legs, and for the shared negative I'm going to attach them first with this resistor leg. That way I'll just have one negative wire instead of 2. Let's switch our focus over to the NeoPixel accent I'm going to be using for the crystal. This process is going to be pretty simple. I'll start out by pre-soldering each of the pads. The only relatively tricky part is this resistor we have to add to the data line. For that, I'm going to solder one wire to each side of the resistor and then put some heat shrink over it. That'll help keep it nice and secure. But now we just attach that wire along with a positive and negative, and then we have the completed accent pixel. Now for both the control box and the accent pixel, I decided to use E6000 to hold them in place, and I guess we'll see how it turns out later. Let's move on to setting up the NeoPixel connector. Like usual, the first step of this process is to solder all the pins in place. After that's done, I'm going to pre-solder each of the pads and then attach all the wires. As you can see, in this build I'm setting up blade detection and only using one data line. The rest of the wires you see are just the standard positive and negatives. Now that the NeoPixel connector is all set up, I just have to put it in the holder that I made for it. I'll also use some E6000 to hold it in place. So this NeoPixel connector holder is a bit taller than you'd normally see. That's because in this build, it has to fit inside the brass piece at the top of the crystal chamber. So for the connector to poke out at the top, it has to sit in a tall holder. But now, while we wait for the E6000 of that section to dry, we can move on to setting up the rest of the parts, which include the OLED display, Bluetooth, and 28mm bass speaker. Let's start by setting up the OLED display. Setting up this part is pretty simple. All you have to do is pre-solder each of the pads and then add the 4 wires to them. Now that that's done, I just have to put it in its place in the chassis. For now I won't be adding any glue, but once I make sure everything works, I'll add some E6000 to make it more secure. Now it's time to set up the Bluetooth. Just like with the OLED display, all we have to do is solder 4 wires to it. With that done, let's put it into the chassis. We now have the Bluetooth module and the OLED display inside the chassis, which means that up next, we have the 28mm bass speaker. Setting up the speaker is always pretty easy. All we have to do is solder 2 wires to it. And with that, the chassis is now set up with an OLED display, Bluetooth module, and 28mm bass speaker. Now we add the battery contacts. That's the negative done. Now we do the positive. With that, I think it's time to check up on our other parts. Looks like the NeoPixel accent for the crystal has been glued down nicely. I'll be gluing in a crystal later, but so far, this looks pretty good. Now let's have a look at the top part of the crystal chamber that holds the NeoPixel connector. Looks like everything is nice and secure, and the pins are still pressable. I wish I'd designed the holder with a bit more wire space though. Now the last thing we have to take a look at is the control box. As long as I can press these buttons without them falling through or moving at all, we're all good. Now that I have all the separate parts ready to go, I can finally put them inside the lightsaber hilt. From the looks of it, I'll have just enough wire space to make this work. And that does it for the NeoPixel connector holder. Now it's time to add the crystal holder, shroud, and control box. Now that the shroud and control box are all set, let's put in the decorative buttons and bunny ears. With that, almost everything is put back together. We just have 2 brass pins left to go, and 1 screw to hold in the shroud. There we go, it's looking nice. And now the majority of this lightsaber has been completely reassembled. But of course this time, we have the control box all set up with working buttons, the NeoPixel connector is added, and we have the NeoPixel accent for the crystal. Now that we have all the parts set up and ready, we can finally move on to bringing this lightsaber to life. Let's install the soundboard. It's important to remove the SD card before soldering to the soundboard. And now it's time to put everything together. For this build in particular, we have a lot of wires going to a lot of places, so for anyone following along building their own lightsaber, I highly recommend referencing the manual. In fact, if you're building your own lightsaber, I would say it's always best to check the manual at every step of the way. And with that, the soundboard is fully installed. To finish up the lightsaber, I'm going to put some E6000 on this decorative piece at the top of the crystal chamber, and then I actually ended up putting the crystal in off camera. I'll go over what happened with that later. But with that, this entire lightsaber build has been officially completed. I'm really happy with how this install turned out. The real quartz crystal in the chamber looks great, and the chassis itself I think looks really clean, especially since I got the wiring to look pretty neat. This is also one of the only chassis designs I've made that shows off the Bluetooth module, and I think that's pretty cool. Now, after setting up the SD card, I came across 2 main problems I needed to fix. It took me a lot of time, but eventually I figured them out. So let's throw in a battery, turn this thing on, and I can show you what I did. So I'm going to show you some of the non-problematic features first. I set up idle animations for the crystal, force activation, and made the crystal mimic the blade. Now as I cycle through the animations for the OLED screen, I can talk about how this relates to the first problem I had to solve. So when I first set up this SD card and was testing the lightsaber, it would occasionally freeze on certain sound fonts. I had no idea what was causing this, so after a lot of time and a lot of research, it turns out it was an issue with the OLED screen. Some fonts already come with their OLED screen animations and some of them do not. Usually for fonts without a dedicated OLED screen, the CFX would default to showing the font's file name, but for some reason this was causing the CFX to freak out and freeze occasionally. So what I ended up doing was going to crystalfocus.net, downloading a bunch of OLED screen animations, and then I put some of those animations into the font folders that needed one. After that was done, I never had any more issues with the lightsaber freezing. Although there was one more thing that caused the freeze glitch to still happen. One of the sound fonts that already had a predefined OLED screen was using an animation that was a bit too heavy for the CFX to manage along with everything else. So in order to prevent that from causing the occasional freeze, I just had to swap that animation out with a less complex one. The lesson to take away from all this is that it's important to make the soundboard's life easier by making it have to think less. Okay, that was a lot of talking all at once, so I'm going to give you guys a brief break and let you enjoy the rest of these animations in peace. And I'm back. I hope you enjoyed those 30-something or so font animations, there were a lot of them, but now I can move on to showing you a cool feature I set up for the crystal. To show it off, I have to go into this font selection menu. From here, as I cycle through the different fonts, you can see that the crystal color changes depending on the font. Normally this doesn't happen, so to get this effect I had to manually create a BMP file for each crystal color and place the color I wanted into each font. So now you know the blade color of each font before you select it. Now I want to talk about the trouble I had with the crystal chamber accent pixel. Basically, when the crystal light was on, after a few seconds the color would completely whitewash itself. Honestly, I spent multiple days trying to solve this issue, including tearing the saber apart, replacing the pixel, and getting outside help with troubleshooting the software. And after all of that work, it turns out it was the easiest and most ridiculous solution. Instead of using a normal RGB pixel, I was using an RGB white pixel. So all I needed to do was change one line in the config, and it worked perfectly. So dumb, but at least I got it figured out. But now that all the problems are fixed, let's put in a blade. Looks like everything is working perfectly. Let me just check to make sure the Bluetooth works too. And that looks pretty good. Not only can you turn this lightsaber on using the button, Bluetooth, and force activation, you can also use gesture controls. So that means this lightsaber officially has 4 different methods of activation, which of course isn't necessary, but it's pretty darn cool. But now we've come to the end of this lightsaber build video. So as per usual, I'll be ending things off with some Bluetooth activations of all the sound fonts.
Negotiations begin.
Thank you all for watching this build, and I'll see you next time.